Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. We're looking at one of my favorite authors of all time today. V.S. Naipaul is, in my personal opinion, one of the most, if not the most important writers in the 20th century, bar none, both for fiction and non-fiction. He's not really well liked in conventional literature circles, but despite that, I still give him that position on a pedestal because I think he was able to dissect issues in the 20th century in a way that no one else has been able to do before or since. His unmasking of the histories of various countries, his razor sharp and cynical insight into the illusions that hold the world together, it was all just an amazing package. Naipaul was Indian by origin, but he's Trinidadian by birth, and he always saw himself as a sort of Caribbean Indian slash Englishman. He came from a pretty low middle class ordinary family. His father was a small time journalist. He won a scholarship to Oxford when he was a kid, and this changed his life. He always wanted to be a writer, and what's amused me reading all his books is that his first couple of books were straight up comedies. It's amazing to contrast where he was as a writer in his youth and what he would later become. If you read his early works like Miguel Street or a House for Mr. Biswas, these are hilarious, powerful, but light-hearted stories. Miguel Street, for example, is just about a street and all the funny characters who live on that street. It's deep, but it's deep in a way that works of humor are deep. In stark contrast to this are the works of fiction and non-fiction he wrote later on in life that explore some of the biggest and most important themes for humanity: nationalism, colonialism, the impact of history. He was always a big picture thinker, and most of his themes centered around the question of identity. If you think about it, he was born in Trinidad, he was Indian by ethnicity, he was British by education and worldview, so he was always an outsider wherever he went. And this sense of external perspective always gave him a unique take on things, always made him see the world for how stark and cynical it really was. And he realized while writing these books that most parts of the world at that time were exactly like him. They were areas and regions looking for their own identity and coming into their own identity. For instance, he wrote two books about Islamic countries among the believers and another called Beyond Belief. And in both, he wasn't interested in Arab power projection or Arab beliefs. He was a lot more interested in Muslim countries that were Islamic but were still struggling with their Islamic identity. As you know, in parts of Islamic culture, the Arab race has a very privileged position. Theologically, it's their language, their culture, their history that is seen as the pure Islamic tradition. So Naipaul went to countries like Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Iran, countries that were emphatically Muslim, but which also had to deal with sort of being second-class citizens within their own religion. His non-fiction trilogy on India is still probably the best piece of analysis ever written about India. And what's funny here again is how his views change over the years. He initially wrote An Area of Darkness in the 60s, where he's just disgusted by the filth and superstition that he sees running rampant in India. He's very, very critical of it. About 15 years later, he writes A Wounded Civilization, where he starts becoming a little more sympathetic and he starts seeing that India is in fact a wounded civilization that is slowly recovering after centuries of British and Asian conquest. And he starts to understand why things are the way they are. And a decade after that, he wrote A Million Mutinies Now, where he starts becoming openly pro-India and he starts looking at how India is now awakening and shedding away all those burdens of history to start asserting its own civilizational identity over the world once again. He was a big supporter of India regaining its cultural heritage, as opposed to most Indian writers and intellectuals who want India to remain secular. Many people didn't like his views, because he never fit the mold of a quote-unquote Indian writer. In the 70s and 80s, there was this new wave of Commonwealth English language writers emerging from India who were becoming a force to be reckoned with. Salman Rushdie, Vikram Seth, Anita Desai, there were many of them. But Naipaul was always an outsider to them and didn't see the world in the typical, conventional, post-colonial sense that they all did. He saw the British Empire as a good thing, but he also saw how these local communities could sometimes be savage and needed civilizing. The books he wrote about Africa are the most polarizing in this regard, where he wrote powerful novels like A Bend in the River, which is all about how many African nations have failed to create stable societies after the Western powers left. And even though it was critically acclaimed, many accused Naipaul at the time of almost suggesting that the British shouldn't have left, because the book is all about how Africans are unable to rule Africa and it's a cesspit of tribal rivalries and superstition. But he never does it in a racist and condescending tone. It's always done with this brutal honesty where you know that he's just calling it as he sees it. Some of his best works of fiction, like In a Free State, Away in the World, Half a Life, Magic Seeds, they all deal with these same issues, and the breadth of his analysis is just incredible. Each page in these books just bursts with great observations, lessons about the world, humanity, society. His warning about the loss of identity rings true to this day, and he could really show how the experience of let's say, a middle class person in the Caribbean was the same as that of a political exile in London, which was the same as some disillusioned communist in India, which was no different from a shopkeeper in Africa. Because he wrote so many stories set in so many different continents, he's one of the most universal writers, and he isn't given enough credit for that. All his protagonists were him, despite them being in different parts of the world. People who felt alienated in the world that they lived in, because all these worlds and cultures and societies were in a state of great turmoil and change themselves. I wish I had 70 minutes here instead of 7, because I could really talk about his work all day, and it's impossible to do justice to it in such a short amount of time. If you want to understand how, let's say, identity works, read Naipaul. In a day and age where many people call themselves savage as a compliment, his scathing analysis really was savage. He refused to bow to political correctness. He refused to surrender to the orthodoxy of post-colonial scholarship. He saw the world for what a messed up place it was, and he called it as he saw it, with very stark, cynical, harrowing, but unforgettable prose and writing. You can read his books in a day, but they stay with you for a lifetime. You might hate his observations, but you will never forget them. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.